Hello, my name is Thiel. I'm lead leveler for Darkest Hour. I'm just going to show a quick video of how to change terrain and terrain layers, and talk about some of the variables in the terrain system for this engine. So the first thing you need to know is the terrain tool, which is right here. What this does is allows you to create new terrain info actors by clicking this button here. Usually you only want to have one terrain actor, but if you want a second one or multiple, you can create them there. This allows you to sort of edit um, terrain layers and add new ones, delete ones, duplicate ones, which I would not recommend ever using the duplication button, either in this or in this, especially in decorations. I'm pretty sure it will crash almost every time. Um, and so you have different tools to manipulate the terrain. I'm not going to go over all those in this video. My goal was to kind of show the more just the variables in the terrain actor. But here you can kind of change some of the variables by right-clicking on each individual layer. You can set the texture from the current one you selected. So for example, if I wanted to change the base layer on my terrain, I could select that, right click and go to set texture from current. You can see it greatly changes the look of the map. And then but that's limited, right? So you want to find your terrain info, and there it is, and you can open it up with F4 properties. F4 brings up the properties, and you bring this down, and I'll just go over the variables on this real fast. So K collision half res, pretty much always leaves that to false. This is the deco layer offset. Sadly, you can't have a offset per deco layer. It's just an overall offset. I don't know why they coded it like that, because it's very limiting, but it is kind of useful sometimes if you need to lower all your decos of like one or two down so they're not floating. But in most cases, this thing is usually a pain in the ass because, like I said, it's across all deco layers. Here are your deco layers, each individual one with all the settings. Inverted. I think what this does will actually just flip the terrain upside down. Yeah, so like it will be like a ceiling terrain. I never use that. Here are your actual texture layers. This is the terrain height map, basically. So you can actually change that. Here's the terrain scaling. And the terrain sector size, I pretty much never change this. However, we may have to in the future. But I think what that deals with is how it breaks the terrain down to handle like rendering the terrain. So basically, how many of these squares are in a sector size? So 16. So it'd be like 4 by 4. I think. I don't know, something like that. And then like, well, let's say you have like an anti-portal or some type of viz blocking thing. Whenever you like walk through, it will know how to break up the terrain into different sizes. And then the vertex light map, I have never messed with that, to be honest. I don't know what that offers. I think that is literally allows you to like have your own light map on the terrain instead of having the engine do it, which could look really good, but it could also be extremely limiting and probably crash or something. So let's go into the terrain layers, and I'll go over some quick variables. The alpha map, that's literally just the alpha map for the layer. Sadly, I don't know why this is a requirement, but the base layer, which basically will be a completely 100% on layer, so it'll just be like it's basically a boolean that says this layer is drawn. Sadly, you even on your base layer, you have to have a full resolution texture to indicate that. You can't like, oh, okay, well, I'll just size it down to like 2 by 2 or something, or just like tell it to be a Boolean alpha map. You can't do that. Like you have to have an extra texture, and it's just so stupid. It's a waste of so much information. Not to mention those textures are a waste of information anyways, because it only uses the alpha channel. The other 3 channels are never used, so more information wasted. Decay friction and restitution, just don't never change those. I honestly don't even think those even factor. I've played with those 2 values a lot, and I can't ever get anything to actually happen with the ragdolls or anything, so I just ignore it. Layer rotation, that's kind of handy for if you need to, for some reason, need to rotate the entire like UVing of the layer on the terrain. Sometimes I use it if I have to use like 2 of the same textures and I just need them rotated. I barely ever have to do that. Here's the actual texture. So here you can see it's AA test, crash test, and there's the texture. You can change how it UVs to the terrain. Pretty much never change this. You always want it XY because if you set anything else, it will look retarded. So. Wait, layer rotation versus texture rotation. See, I think this is actually what you want. I don't know what the layer rotation does. I'm pretty sure just leave the layer rotation alone and then change the texture rotation. You could pan it, which I don't think is a good idea. Don't ever change those. And the UV scale, which is something that you'll probably often have to change from like 1 or to like 2 or 3 or 4, and I never go above 6. So if you put 6 on here, it's gonna look pretty crazy. Yeah, see how low detail it starts to get. I mean, yeah, it doesn't tile as bad, but like when you start to look down, it's like what the hell. So I usually try to keep it between 1 and 4, I think. And that's it for the terrain layers. I'll just go over the quick deco layers. We have align to terrain 1. That means the deco layer aligns to the terrain. For instance, these are deco layer, and you notice how they're kind of aligned to the terrain. That's what that does. If you turn the 0, it wouldn't be aligned to the terrain. It would just be cutting through the terrain and floating over here a little bit. So that's what that determines. It's a bool value, but they set it to an int for some reason. So you can actually type in like any number here, but it's only registering 0 and 1. The color map allows you to change how the color comes down on the decos in various places of the level. The density map is sort of the same thing, but like choose where to draw it. And what I have done here is I actually just use a terrain layer to determine where the deco appears. So that way I don't have to have a separate layer. And I'm just using this gravel. Actually, sorry, I wasn't even aware what I was looking at. I'm looking at these stones on the gravel here. So anywhere this texture is painted, these stones will appear, and this allows you to change how often the density is on the of the deco on the terrain. I'm not sure exactly how this works, this density multiplier. I would assume that it allows you to put in any value here, and it will increase how many appear. But there is a limitation to that, and I'll go over that in a minute. Detail mode, I never change this. I always leave it low. I think if you turn it on higher, it will only appear, this crap will only appear on higher settings, which is kind of useful, but not that useful. Disregard terrain lighting. Um, you can change that to affect the lighting and brightness of your decos. I pretty much don't ever mess with that unless I have to. For instance, if it's useful or not to turn it on or off, I will. Like, I just like let's say all my decos are really dark or whatever, and I'll start trying to play with those settings to get the deco to be brighter to match the level. Now, draw order. This is important. Sometimes you want the draw order to be because sometimes like deco layers are a problem. You can like prone in them, and you can see through them, and so changing the draw order can sometimes prevent issues like that. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it doesn't help. I don't know. So it's one of those things. Play it. See if it, play around with that. Fade out radius. That's how long it draws or how far away it will draw. And the min value will basically be where it begins to fade out, and the max value will be, okay, no more draw. And so it's useful if you because you can actually make it kind of to where it kind of alphas out, which actually has a really nice look to it, because otherwise if you put these values the same, it will just pop. You'll see it just like instantly disappear, and it looks really ugly. So play around with those two values, and the farther apart you have them, the more it won't pop. But there is some disadvantages to having them so far apart. For instance, in this case, the rocks, you can't really see it on this because the rocks are so small, but you can actually kind of see through the rocks when you're like just a little bit farther away from them. But that's actually kind of what I wanted, so it works great for these little tiny rocks. Force draw. Now what that does is it tells it to always draw this deco layer regardless of the user settings. In this case, the rocks are so small and have no gameplay, or don't even like prevent or conceal or anything the player. So I let if the players want to, they can turn off deco, and it will remove this stuff from render, and it will save their FPS. That is about the only case I'll do that. This grass also, because it's so low to the ground, I think I've set up to be not force draw, but anytime, any other time when I'm using deco layers that are like high and players can be concealed in it, I definitely force draw that deco layer. Lit directional, that's basically saying your sun's or your lighting can affect the deco layer. I barely ever turn that on. Max per quad. Now this has to do with your density multiplier. So there's a maximum number that they'll put on. I think a quad is, I could be wrong about this, but I think it's 4 squares. I can't confirm that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. So this value usually is like 2. But in the case of all these rocks, I have it 12, which is pretty high. I've turned it up to as high as like 36 before, though. Random yaw. Oh, okay. This determines if there is a random yaw value to rotate the deco. Very useful to making your deco grass or whatever look more natural and not so repetitious. The problem with it is it does not randomize before it aligns to the terrain. It does it after it aligns to the terrain. So it's, whoever coded this was an idiot. But basically, you can't use align to terrain and random yaw, because it will just look goofy as shit. So what they needed to do is like random yaw and then run the align to terrain. But this engine just isn't set up for that. So sadly, let's see, the scale map. So you can actually have like another map, kind of like the color map, that determines how to scale. So if you want this deco layer to be bigger in another part in the level, you can do that. Pretty cool, but I don't ever use it, to be honest. Scale multiplier. So this allows you to change the size of the deco layer. As you can see here for these rocks, I've made it really small. I've turned it down. 1.0 is standard size. You can make them bigger or smaller. Just remember that deco layers, deco assets, whatever you want to call them, all these things can never have collision on. So don't ever use big things or things that should have collision for your deco layer. And seed, what that does is it basically is like a random seed. So if you want to quickly change the deco, you can change that seed, but I wouldn't recommend changing it unless you know what you're doing. What I like to do is come in here and set a seed. When I first make the deco layer, I'll set a seed and leave it to that seed. That basically allows you to change how it randomizes onto the terrain. Pretty cool, but also, let's say like your deco layer is very specific to where you've painted it on and you've had to kind of like smooth out the terrain in certain areas. If you change that, it will force you to basically go back and do all that smoothing and try basically get it to where there's not floating deco everywhere again. So that's important. Show on invisible terrain. Basically, if you've hidden the terrain, if you have that 1, it will still render on the invisible terrain. I pretty much never set that to on. Show on terrain, well, starts off as a 1. Changing it to 0 will basically mean it doesn't render. And then here's allows you to change the static mesh. All right, I think that's it for the terrain info actor and the variables it possesses, and that's it.